Hello? Can you hear me in the back?
Yes.
Wonderful. All right, fabulous. Hello, beautiful people. I'm Bethany Droff. I do have to put that on my paper so I remember to say my own name. I'm the Executive Director of the Museum of Old Newbury, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to General Benjamin Franklin Butler, A Noisy, Fearless Life. What a great way to be described. Thank you to all of you for attending this program, especially to our members and volunteers that are here today. If you're not a member, I would like to invite you to become one. Please join us at newburyhistory.org/membership. A special extra thanks to Sally Chandler, Bill Quigley, and Alex Burke, who provided the beautiful snacks in the back of the room. They're all wonderful board members of ours. And James Bruger, who met you at the door. Well done. And of course to James Droff in the back of the room, president of Ipswich Ale, who donates beer to all of our events. He is also my husband, so he must. While I have you here, I'd also like to invite you to several upcoming programs. On Wednesday, May 10th, we've added a night to the Fashion Night Out with Lois Vallejo. She sold out so fast that we added another night, so she's wonderfully agreed to do that for us. This is Girl Style from the Civil War to 1900. She's a costume historian and a hoot, so you should come if you can. We're also very much looking forward to May 18th at 6:30 at St. Paul's. We anticipate this will be a big event. We will welcome John Forty, the heirloom gardener, who will be talking about traditional plants and skills. Some of you are probably familiar with John Forty. He has recently gained an extraordinary social media following. He's a bona fide social media star, but many of us know him from Strawberry Bank and various other previous engagements of his. He's a wonderful speaker. So I encourage you to get tickets to that as soon as you can. And of course, our signature event, the Old Newbury Garden Tour, which features 12 gardens in the area with unique and varied gardens and landscapes on June 10th and 11th. Tickets for the garden tour are also on sale on the website. Please do go to the website. We are doing, since COVID, certainly more and more of our transactions on the web. I would also encourage you. You may have noticed that more and more of our events are selling out. Sometimes we can do a second one, sometimes we can't. Sorry? Oh, sorry. Yes, you can also come. So if you see an event that you want to attend, don't sit on your hands. Get a ticket. I hate to see anybody not be able to come to something because they thought they could get in at the last minute. So more things are selling out. That's great news for us. But we want you to be able to come. A few housekeeping notes, please mute your cell phones. And restrooms are through the back door on the right and the left. And with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Elizabeth Leonard. Dr. Leonard is Colby College's Gibson Professor of History Emerita. She earned her PhD in U.S. History from the University of California, Riverside in 1992 and is the author of several articles and 7 books. I think maybe it's 8 now.
No, this is 7.
Okay, 7 books on the Civil War era, including Yankee Women, Gender Battles in the Civil War, All the Daring of the Soldier, Women of the Civil War Armies, and Lincoln's Forgotten Ally. Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt of Kentucky, which was named co-winner of the Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize in 2012. Her new book, Benjamin Franklin Butler, A Noisy, Fearless Life, has just won the 2023 John Now, got it, okay. Center for Civil War History's prestigious book prize. And it was a finalist. This is hot off the presses. You just found this out, didn't you?
I just found out on Friday, and the official announcement just went out yesterday.
This is a very prestigious book prize, particularly with Civil War history. So well done. And was a finalist once again for the Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize. A little bit of a tongue twister, but please join me in welcoming her. Thank you.
If I have notes, do I need to move that microphone up?
Yeah. Do you want me to move it over here?
That'd be great.
Okay.
And is it okay if I put my water right here?
Absolutely.
Okay, I don't want to mess up your table.
No worries at all.
Let's see.
There we go. That's not too intrusive.
No. Just have to get a tissue in case my nose starts to run. Okay, I'm ready. Thank you so much to Bill and the rest of the good people here at the Museum of Old Newbury for inviting me to be here and for making my trip possible. I'm on my way to New York City, actually, so this is a perfect place to stop, catch my breath, give a talk, meet you wonderful people, stay at the lovely Essex street in, I'm not sure, it's beautiful, and what gorgeous weather you ordered for me, so I really appreciate it. I want to tell you how I understand that this talk will go. I want to tell you why I wrote this biography in the first place, what drew me to this project, and then already I've been hearing you chattering, and I've heard the expression beast Butler in this crowd. I hear it everywhere I go, and I want to tell you why I think we need to abandon that way of describing my friend Benjamin Butler. And if we have time, of course, I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have. I've been acquainted with Benjamin Butler for a long time. Anybody here in the room who knows anything about Civil War history or has done any reading in Civil War history will know that you bump up against Butler all the time. As a Civil War historian, he is unavoidable. He just pops up everywhere, and also throughout the 19th century. So I kept running into him in the course of my other research, and I've often said that I call him Forrest Butler or Butler Gump sometimes because of the way he just seems to show up everywhere. I also taught at Colby College for nearly 30 years, and he was a Colby College alumnus, and it was called Waterville College at the time that he was there. He graduated in the class of 1838. And I always think it's funny to note that according to a previous biographer of a portion of his life, Butler thought that Waterville was a very dull town. And our students still think that. I happen to like Waterville myself, and I live about 5 minutes from campus, and I actually find it getting to be a little too exciting now that it's getting gentrified. So I probably should have been born in the 19th century. Anyway, he was a Colby alumnus, class of 1838, but he's never gotten the attention at Colby that I increasingly think he deserves and keep nagging the college to accord to him. The college did pay a great deal more attention to another Civil War era alumnus, Elijah P. Lovejoy, whom some of you may have heard of. Lovejoy was a native Mainer from the area. And he was certainly, in some ways at least, less controversial than Benjamin Butler came to be. He also was a martyr for freedom of the press, and so that's a good reason to celebrate him. Although I will say his fame at Colby, he graduated in the 1820s, but he became important to the college during the Cold War, which I think is very interesting. That's when they first started giving the Lovejoy Award, and it was sort of pitting American freedom of press against what was perceived to be Soviet squashing of the press, not even perceived to be. But anyway, so Lovejoy's gotten a lot of attention, Butler much less so. I do like to needle Lovejoy a little bit at this point and say he was a rabid anti-Catholic, and for some reason that aspect of his character has never been talked about at Colby in all the celebration of Lovejoy this and Lovejoy that. There were also very specific things that happened that sort of pushed me in this direction, and one of them, many of you may have heard of the Civil War historian Gary Gallagher, great historian, wonderful human being. I actually just saw him the other day when I was in Virginia, and Gary, several years ago, and I were at a conference together, and I was bemoaning the fact that Bowdoin College, Colby's rival, had Joshua Chamberlain as an alumnus, and they've made so much of him, and he's so dashing, and everybody loves Joshua Chamberlain, and he gets in all these movies, and so on, and all we had was dumpy Butler, and who was only 5'4", actually, so he was small and quite rotund. Anyway, and with the droopy eyes, I mean, he wasn't dashing like it's true. Even he joked about his strabismus and his droopy eyelids and so on. So he was not the dashing figure that Joshua Chamberlain was, and I was whining about this to Gary. And Gary, took me to task. He's a very nice man, but he said, Elizabeth, really, you need to look into Butler a little bit more closely and stop bemoaning this. There's a lot that Colby has to be proud about, Butler having graduated from there. So right around the same time that Gary gave me that scolding, the college also decided to bring out from storage this enormous, and I mean enormous, portrait of Butler that Mr. Butler himself had sailed up the Kennebec River to bring to the college a few years before he died. He had no place else to store it apparently, so he brought it up to the college where he thought it would be appreciated, and it hung at the college for a long time. Then it was put away and sort of disappeared for a few years, and then in 2013 the college decided, in connection with its bicentennial, to bring the portrait back out, and they asked me as the Civil War historian to write the little legend that would go with the portrait. So I agreed to do that, and that pushed me in the direction of having to do some more research about him. And I found, to my great interest, that there was actually quite a collection of material at Colby itself in our special collections and archives department in the library, including an article written in 1964 on the occasion of the centennial of the Civil War by my predecessor at Colby, a man named Harold Raymond, who I knew as Hal. He was the chair of the department when I hired into Colby. He was there from 1952 to 1993, over 40 years, a Harvard-trained historian who never published much, didn't publish much. He came to Colby at a time different from the time when I came. When I came to Colby, we were expected to publish as well as teach. When Hal came to Colby, he just taught and taught and taught, and he taught whatever he was expected to teach. He taught French Revolution, he taught Russian Revolution, he taught American Revolution, he taught the Civil War, whatever they gave him to teach. He probably taught 6 courses a semester, as far as I know. And he didn't publish much, but he did publish this article in 1964 in the Colby Quarterly magazine, the library's magazine, and it was entitled Ben Butler, A Reappraisal. And I read this article and I was fascinated. In it, it's a wonderful article that looks at Butler as a politician, a businessman, and a soldier, and then looks at all the stories that have circulated since the Civil War about Butler and kind of unpacks them and reconsiders each one of them and concludes that all of the negative all the negativity that has clung to his memory, in quotation marks, is really unfairly stuck to him unfairly. And Hal concluded that, and now I'm quoting, when stripped of their more dramatic overtones, Butler's weaknesses were those of the typical Northern politician, businessman, and amateur soldier. And while Butler surely had his share of failings, and I can attest to that, his many accomplishments and successes made a substantial contribution to the preservation of the Union and the advancement of social justice. This intrigued me. Why was it that Hal Raymond said these things about someone whom I knew to be remembered by most people, even up in friendly Waterville, where he had been in school? Most people knew him and described him as Beast Butler, or Spoons Butler, or Picayune Butler, or Bottled Up Butler, or other kinds of epithets. So those kinds of things pushed me towards actually doing the biography. And then finally, I would say that I had done a previous biography, the biography of Joseph Holt, whom you may or may not know, but I can tell you he's a very challenging figure and was also someone much maligned in his lifetime and in the aftermath of his death, a very challenging figure. And I felt that I had done a pretty good job with Holt, and I had found the work very interesting to do, to try to take this figure who had a place in the historical record that was at variance with what a lot of the documents I read seemed to indicate. And I thought I would try again. And hence you have this biography. I will also note that the wonderful subtitle of the book, A Noisy, Fearless Life, I'll say 2 things about that. The phrase noisy, fearless comes from another article by my predecessor, Hal Raymond, to whom the book is dedicated, he described Butler as being a noisy, fearless advocate for various people. And I love that phrase. And the other thing I'll say about it is I would be very proud if that goes on my tombstone. She led a noisy, fearless life. I'm trying very hard. So why? Well, let me stop and give you just a sense of a couple of the through lines that characterize this biography that I think are really important. One is that it really is the story of the journey of this man's life. And I try to demonstrate, and I hope that I succeed in doing so, that development over time, change over time, growth, development, and so on, can happen at the same time that a person maintains a profound kind of consistency. You can grow and change, but there can be core things that go with you all the way. And I think this is true of Benjamin Butler. I think his life, in fact, displayed this pairing of change and consistency in a rather interesting and beautiful way. In 1883, a decade before he died, Butler wrote, "God made me in only one way. I must always be with the underdog in the fight. I can't help it, I can't change, and upon the whole, I don't want to." My research suggests that Butler was indeed consistent throughout his life on this score. He was very much a man for the underdog. However, what changed and expanded over time was the group of people he characterized as the underdogs who needed his support. So he began his life in New Hampshire as the poor youngest child of a woman who had already 3 stepchildren and 2 older children, and then Butler was born, and her husband had died right before Butler was born. And so he began his life there. His mother moved as a boarding house keeper to Lowell, Massachusetts, in those early days of the Lowell Mills. And his early years were spent in Lowell surrounded by the textile mill people, and particularly the mill girls. And those were the underdogs who drew his attention. The poor and the working women especially in Lowell, Massachusetts. And then immigrants who came into Lowell to replace that first group of textile workers. But as he moved into the Civil War and encountered slavery firsthand, and black people for really the first time in his life in any meaningful way, his sense of black Americans, and particularly enslaved Americans, as people who were the nation's underdogs for whom he sought to fight, and with whom he sought to fight, that sense grew for him. And I will say there is just no question that over time, his devotion and respect for the freed people, the enslaved people, black Americans generally, and likewise their devotion and respect to him grew apace, and it characterized the rest of his life. Likewise, however, not surprisingly, came the hatred and denigration of others who felt that those were not people who deserved his support. He didn't deserve anybody's support. Who cares about him? He's just a lousy, poor scrapper from New Hampshire who really, doesn't belong in the halls of power, etc. So he was somebody who over the course of his life was achieved tremendous respect and tremendous hatred. And fortunately for me, I guess, he just carried on anyway. For many of us, actually, and for many of the people he tried to help, he carried on. And I think this is a quote from the book. He pressed on, determined, clever, irascible, humorous, imperfect, noisy, and fearless. So that's an important theme in the book. And another important theme in the book, which is true for much of historical study, I think, is that perceptions of this individual, this Benjamin Butler individual, varied during his life, varied after he died, vary today, depending a great deal on who's looking, who's examining him, who's considering this person, who's perceiving him, who's the creator of the sources that one is looking at to understand him. And one of the things that I tried very hard to do in this biography is make a point of examining sources that had been largely missed by others in the past. It's not that nobody's written about Butler, but they tend to go back to the same sources and write about them again. And I tried to examine sources that had been largely missed, if not, if you want to be cynical, purposefully ignored in past studies. And here I would specifically point to materials which are not, there are not just a few of them, there are quite a few of them, materials that offer insights into Black Americans' perceptions of this figure. So if you read what Black Americans have to say about him and how Black Americans responded to him in his lifetime versus how many white Americans responded to him, you get a very different picture of who this man was. I also made an effort to go back to the familiar sources that others had used and say, and ask different questions of those sources. And ask, why is this aspect of his story just repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated, but this other thing, they just keep not telling us about it. They just keep not telling us about it. And a great example that I have encountered, so you can try me if you want in the Q&A period and I'll give you the same answer, but a popular example of this is for someone to say to me, but did you know, I can talk for an hour about all these different things that Butler did in his life, and then somebody at the end of the talk will say, did you know he voted for Jefferson Davis 50 times in Charleston in 1860 at the Democratic National Convention? And I think, yes, I knew that. I sure did. But why are you focusing on that when I've told you he did this and he did that and he did these other things between 1860 and, mind you, he lived till 1893. 33 more years after that, he did a lot of really, really good things. So why is that the thing that constantly gets repeated? And this other stuff is left aside. What's the investment in pointing out that particular aspect? What's the investment that so many of his previous people who have previously written about him have had in caricaturing him as beast, as spoons, as bottled up so-and-so? I have some theories. I'm happy to share some of those theories with you later. But it is interesting to me which aspects of his story and why. I guess the other thing I could say is, why are his failures, and he did fail, numerous times, particularly on the battlefield. He was not a particularly good battlefield commander. But I think there were several Union generals who screwed up occasionally, But Butler, it's like, that's all we want to talk about, is what an idiot he was, and how terrible he was at Big Bethel, which almost nobody even remembers Big Bethel, because then comes Bull Run. So if Big Bethel gets shoved to the side by Bull Run, why then do you have to tell me about Ben Butler again, messing up at Big Bethel? Anyway, it's interesting to me who controls the narrative, how the narrative gets shaped with him. I have told many audiences that when I first was drafting the manuscript, to counteract the way that I think that Butler has been remembered by so many other people in the past, I thought, rather foolishly, admittedly, but I thought about starting with the funeral and then going backwards, which for a biography would be very confusing to the audience. And really, I was glad my editor told me that was not a good idea to do it that way. However, the reason for doing it that way, the reason I thought about doing that is because his funeral in Lowell, Massachusetts, which was preceded by quite a big ceremony in Washington, D.C., which is where he died very suddenly in January of 1893, was massive. And it was a shock to the nation that this great man had died. And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people gathered to witness his passing and to pay their respects, and not just including his friends and family and closest thousands of friends, but Black Americans came in vast numbers. Frederick Douglass sent flowers. Frederick Douglass's sons were pallbearers. This is a big event. The book has a nice picture in it. Well, it's not a very nice picture because it's from an old newspaper, so it didn't print very well, but you can see how many people were there, and you get a sense of how, when he died, this is who Butler was known to be. And now he's boiled down to, oh yeah, Beast Butler, spoons. So I'm eager for us to stop calling him Beast, unless, as I like to say, we mean it in the way Urban Dictionary defines beast. Those young people, they're so clever. So Urban Dictionary, I discovered, describes the term beast, someone who is a beast, in a way that actually does sound to me rather like Benjamin Butler. The definition is a person that is extremely talented at whatever they do and always displays a great determination, dedication, and resilience to always win or want to win. That sounds just like my Benjamin Butler, or almost just like him. So if we're going to use that term, then just please, trademark or whatever you use, Urban Dictionary. Put a footnote. I'm using the Urban Dictionary term. So why do I think we should stop calling him Beast and think about him in a different way? First of all, I would say we need to think about his whole life. He got the nickname Beast during the time that he was in New Orleans in 1862, serving as the Union Army's commander of the occupation forces there. And in New Orleans, I suppose you could say, he was quite stern. He was perhaps even beastly from some people's perspective. The two specific events that are often recalled when this nickname is mentioned, is that when William Mumford, a Confederate loyalist, tore down the U.S. flag from the Mint and dragged it through the streets of New Orleans after Butler's forces had arrived. Butler had him arrested. He went through a military trial, and he was convicted, and Butler said, we're going to execute him, and they did. So, and many people said, oh my God, that's so shocking that he would do that. And I have to say, it's terrible. Execution is terrible. But this is wartime. New Orleans was anarchy. He was the occupation commander. This is the test case for Reconstruction, the test case for the first major city where a Union commander is taking control. What are you supposed to do? Say, well, William, really, you shouldn't have done that. Go home and be nice and don't do that anymore. The other thing that he did, and he never executed anybody else after that, by the way. And, pardon?
He executed his own people, his own soldiers who were caught for thievery.
Well,
I'm sorry, it's your show. I shouldn't have said I apologize. I shouldn't have interrupted. I apologize.
The other thing that he got the nickname Beast for in New Orleans is for the famous Woman Order, which is the order where he's General Orders 28, nicknamed the Woman Order, where he said that Confederate women who were wearing Union soldiers' bones as necklaces, crossing the street when they saw Union soldiers coming, getting off the trolley when the Union soldiers got on, spitting on Union soldiers, dumping their chamber pots out the window on the Union soldiers' heads, etc., that if they continued to do that, he was going to have them arrested and throw them in jail and treat them like prostitutes. And some people thought this was pretty shocking. How dare you treat these lovely Confederate women who I self-identified as she-rebels. How dare you treat them this way? So he was considered a beast by many, and that nickname then followed him. But if we look at his whole life outside of New Orleans, and I would even say, I'm not sure we should be calling him Beast for what he did in New Orleans even, but if we think about what he achieved in his early life, where he started as a lawyer in Lowell, Massachusetts, fighting for the mill girls, taking their cases and taking them to court and winning them redress from their employers and so on, cutting his teeth as a lawyer on helping the underdogs in Lowell, as a lawyer for the factory workers, especially women. If we think about his unyielding unionism in the months before the war, where he was also very important to Lincoln because he was a loyal Democrat. He was a war Democrat, and Lincoln was very eager to make sure that the war was not just a war of Republicans against the South. Butler's unionism was unyielding, and his unyielding unionism led him to be the commander of the first forces to get troops into Washington to protect the nation's capital against presumed invasion from the South, or anticipated invasion from the South. So his loyal and his determined unionism also helped him to keep Maryland in the Union in those early weeks of the war, which is an enormously important, enormously consequential development. For that, we need to thank Mr. Butler as well. He didn't always do things the way that perhaps Winfield Scott would have wanted him to do things, but he was very strong-willed, he was very creative, he was very thoughtful, he was very dedicated to the Union. And he made every effort in those early months, or the weeks of the war, to demonstrate that. And we need to celebrate that. Of course, if people remember anything about his early months in the war, they remember that he was the author of the contraband policy. Barely a month into the fighting, he was at Fortress Monroe in Virginia. 3 enslaved men came to the fort and asked for his protection and asked him not to send them back to their owners. Has anybody, by the way, seen the play, Ben Butler? Has it come to Newburyport? If it does come here, I saw it in Portland, I think it's in Washington, and it tends to show in small theaters. I know it was showing in Western Massachusetts a couple of years ago. It's just called Ben Butler, it's by Richard Strand, and it's a play about the moment where the day, the 24-hour period where he constructs this contraband policy. Over the course of about 24 hours, Butler pondered what to do about these 3 enslaved men who had come to him for protection. And of course, in the end, he said, I'm not sending you back. I will keep you and we will treat you as contraband of war. And by making that decision, he significantly carved out or began the pressure that was going to lead to Congress passing laws, Lincoln making decisions, and so on. Up until that point, at the start of the war, the federal government had not made any policy decisions about what to do about the many, many people who were going to run away from slavery. Butler is the first to do it. And the contraband policy is not only consequential for the federal government's decision-making subsequently around the issue of slavery, but for the enslaved people's decisions too, because without cell phones, without the access to the telegraph, without regular telephones, without all kinds of tools that we might think are necessary today, within days, Fort Monroe was surrounded by hundreds of runaways who then had to be managed and put to work and so on. But they came flooding to the fort, and this was an enormous beginning for the process that would lead to emancipation. Of course, then he was the commander at New Orleans, and he was a stern commander, but I think it's important to consider what he was tasked with doing so many hundreds of miles from Washington in a precarious and rebellious and anarchic place where he not only had to occupy the city with his forces, he also had to hold the city and test the waters for reconstruction and keep the city safe from the annual scourge of yellow fever, which he did. And I have to say, during the height of COVID, I thought, oh, if only Butler was here, he would know what to tell us to do, because he did a great job in New Orleans with the yellow fever. Of course, he would have quarantined everybody offshore or something, I suppose. But he put people to work cleaning the streets, and he paid them to do it, and he found ways to feed people who were starving. I mean, his work in New Orleans was really very impressive, and it came across to many Confederates, understandably, as harsh, because if you wanted to tear down the federal government and someone was stopping you from doing that, I guess that might seem a little harsh. But anyway, what he did in New Orleans, I think, not perfect, but certainly his successes deserve our recognition. I'll just say a few more things about the war. One is that I guess the most important is his relationship with black soldiers, which began while he was in New Orleans, where he turned the Louisiana Native Guard, these African-American soldiers, into federal troops. They were Confederate troops. They were reluctant Confederate troops who were supposed to defend Louisiana against the Union, and he just sort of gathered them up and turned them into the Louisiana Native Guard and black troops for the Union. And then later on in the war, he was the commander of the Army of the James, which was largely a black army, and he was, as I said earlier, not just their commander, but very much devoted to these soldiers, and they to him. He learned so much from them and was transformed by his experience with them, and spent all the rest of his life, indeed, helping black soldiers to apply for pensions and helping them in any way that he could. So I'm not blind to his flaws and his failures, but I think it's worthwhile to examine his flaws and failures in a larger context and also lift up his many important successes. And that's just up to 1865. But when I talk about Ben Butler, I am always interested to find that most of his life came after the war, and nobody seems to know much about that. 30 years he lived after the war, during which he spent 10 years as a representative from Massachusetts in the United States Congress, and as representative from Massachusetts in the United States Congress, he did everything he could to make the Union victory have lasting, transformative significance, again, particularly for the freed people. He also led the opposition to Andrew Johnson and led the impeachment effort, and I just think that's grand that he did, because I think until recently, Andrew Johnson was the worst president we ever had, and his Reconstruction policies were catastrophically lenient. And Butler saw it, and he went after it. He thought Andrew Johnson was the biggest obstacle to justice in the aftermath of the war and to Union victory having any lasting meaning, and he wanted him out of there. I have to wonder what he'd think about Tennessee today. We could use him again. Send him out to Tennessee, straighten him out there. He actively promoted the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. He actively promoted the Civil Rights Bill of 1875 and was given a lot of credit for getting that bill through. He was very active in the in advocacy for the force bills of the early 1870s, which were designed to suppress the KKK and other white supremacist groups. He was a suffragist, a women's suffragist. He was a friend of Victoria Woodhull and Susan B. Anthony and others, and allowed them opportunities to come to Congress and speak on behalf of women's suffrage. He was a supporter of workers' rights. He was a supporter of greenback currency. He was a supporter of many policies in the course of his post-war career that would level the economic playing field for laboring Americans and the poor in particular. He was the head from 1866 to 1879 of the National Homes for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers. He was active, obviously, in Veterans Affairs and helping veterans generally apply for their pensions, but particularly black veterans. He was the president of the whole organization, National Homes for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers, and he certainly was well known at the very first one of those homes, which is in Togus, Maine, not far from where I live, just down the road in Augusta. He was active in trying to desegregate West Point. He thought it was important that black men should not only be regular soldiers, but that they should be officers as well. And he nominated a series of young black men to cadetships at West Point, overcoming his own bitterness at not having been able to get to West Point himself. He really did want to go. His mommy wanted him to go to Colby, and he wanted to go to West Point, and he actually appealed to Mr. Cushing to help him get into West Point, but that didn't work out, so he went to Colby. But he thwarted his mother's will by not becoming a minister, which is what she really wanted him to do. Anyway, he tried to desegregate West Point in his own way, and his son, Benjamin, Ben Israel was his name, was one of the closest friends that Henry Flipper, the first black to graduate from West Point, had while he was at the academy, and he talks about Benjamin Butler, Ben Israel Butler, in his memoirs. Butler, of course, served as governor of Massachusetts for one short, one-year-long term towards the end of his political, well, it was the last term of service that he had as a politician, during which he investigated the corruption of the Tewksbury Almhouse and made the people at Harvard University, who already hated him, hate him even more than they had hated him before. He also appointed the first black judge to the Charlestown Municipal Court, making this the first African-American judge in the United States. And he repeatedly crossed swords with Massachusetts elites. Finally, he ran for president in 1884 as the candidate of the Greenback and anti-monopoly parties, not as the Democratic candidate, which was Grover Cleveland. He didn't win. He really didn't even get a great vote, but he didn't really expect to win. I think he would have liked to win. I mean, he never, he was a beast in that sense. He always wanted to win. And it was a serious campaign, but he was getting older. And he also felt like, what we're really doing here, even if we don't win, is building a foundation for what later became the People's Party. He wanted to found a People's Party, a party of people across all kinds of lines of division who would fight the banks and fight the powers that be and level the economic playing field. So there's a lot about Butler to celebrate and think about above and beyond his time in New Orleans, or a nickname that he got, or a failure on the battlefield at one point in the war, and so on. And I will say, also related to this issue of, was he significant in the war? If you look at Harper's Weekly magazine, Illustrated magazine, from June of 1861, so early on in the war, he is the front page story of that issue. And the story basically says, this is the person who is going to win the war for the Union. So he wasn't, but he helped in his own way, and even General Grant, who gave him the nickname or said the words that turned out to be Bottled Up Butler at Bermuda 100. Bottled Up Butler. He regretted that he had said that, and he had lovely things to say about Butler in his memoirs. So in closing, I will say Butler enjoyed the deep loyalty and love of many people, including his very big and generations and generations of his family. He also earned the enduring affection, respect, and gratitude of many other Americans outside of his family, including suffragists, laborers, black Americans, generally poor people, and so on, many of whom were utterly despondent at the time of his sudden death in 1893. He also suffered derision, hatred, enmity, not just from Confederates and former Confederates, and not from all of them, because as the post-war period extended, poor Southerners, poor white Southerners, and poor black Southerners looked to Butler for help and forgave him, for having been their enemy during the war. But there were Confederates, leading Confederates, former Confederates, and powerful white Northerners in Massachusetts and around the country who did whatever they could to diminish his influence and undermine his agenda for their own reasons. He was by no means perfect, but to return to my predecessor at Colby, the words of Hal Raymond in the article where he called him a noisy, fearless advocate, he said, this is Hal, if Colby students, and I like to add, and the rest of us, if Colby students would champion the underprivileged as freely and uphold the American Republic as faithfully as Benjamin Butler, they too would deserve to be honored by the college and by the rest of us, and I would have to agree with that. So I'll stop there and take your questions. Yes.
I recently read, and it surprised me, that when Lincoln was looking for a vice president on the second term, he decided to throw Hannibal Hamlin out. His first choice was Benjamin Butler.
Yes, I've heard that.
And the book that I was reading quoted Butler as rejected.
Right. And sort of in a very snarky way. Well, if you can promise me you'll be dead by, or something, this sort of,
something along that line.
Right.
But it does show you the great respect and power that Butler had at the time. And it also raises a great sort of what if in American history. What if Butler, instead of Andrew Johnson, had become the president?
Anybody but Johnson. No, not anybody. But I have seen actually a lot of online chatter about the what ifs. If only, because I think there's many people who engage in counterfactual history with yearning, feel like if only someone like Butler had been in charge of Reconstruction early on, we wouldn't be in this mess we're in today and still living with the reverberations of failed Reconstruction, particularly around racial issues, but around a lot of issues today. So, I'm happy to, ponder that too. But I will say, I have seen that same story repeated many places. The one place I have not seen, or a place and an important place I have not seen that story of Lincoln offering him or thinking of naming him vice president. The one place I have not seen that's important that it's not mentioned is in Butler's autobiography. And I'll tell you, if Lincoln, mentioned to him, I'm thinking about having you be my vice president, as if that's how it was done in those days, which I'm not even sure I don't even think that's how it was done. But Butler would have included that. So I don't think, I will say I have never seen hard documentary evidence to show that story is true. I don't know exactly where it originates, but I have to believe Butler would have been crowing about it because his autobiography is full of, it's a wonderful book and sort of you can't just read that to know, who this guy is. But he's trying to explain himself a lot and he doesn't mention it. So I'm skeptical that it happened. It may be more yearning, than anything else. And I can join in that. I don't know. I don't know if Lincoln had lived. I used to say when I wrote a couple books, well, Joseph Holt, of course, was the prosecutor of the Lincoln assassins, and I had written another book about the assassination before that. And, I used to go around and give talks and say, well, except for the fact that he was dead, that he was murdered, I think that Lincoln got a good deal out of, the end of the war because he didn't have to deal with Reconstruction. And nobody would have I mean, what a mess, you know. I don't know who could have navigated that. Butler might have given it a good try. Lincoln would have been better than Johnson, that's for sure. I'm sure of that. But we'll never know, and here we are. I don't want to not have responded to your comment. It did a little throw me off at the moment, but
I apologize.
That's all right.
I should have left that for this point rather than interrupt you.
that's okay. So you have evidence of him in an inordinate way, having his soldiers.
My brother and I have read a book, was it Nolan?
Dick Nolan,
Oh, yeah,
the Dab the Shanky.
yeah.
And in that, there was we agreed that Butler had to take charge of New Orleans, there's no question about it. Otherwise it would
Chaos.
have been chaos, yes.
Well, there
that's
was
correct.
chaos. He had
Yeah.
to put the chaos down.
And there was a series of situations that came about, and it came to light that his own army was pilfering, was stealing. And the local people were saying, okay, now what are you gonna do about this? You know, are you going to have the same set of standards? So he was faced with that same situation. You've already executed the Southerners, and so him being the person in charge had to follow through with it, and he did. He said, at the court-martial, found the army personnel guilty, and he executed.
I'm just gonna have to go back and look
Well,
at that, because
but
I
that's
don't,
fine.
and are you, well, my understanding is that he never had anybody else executed.
Yeah.
Maybe that he agreed to a conviction and then Lincoln overturned the execution, I don't know. I'd have to go back and look at the sources.
I understand that.
But I also want to add that he financially supported, and in other ways supported, Mumford's widow for much of the rest of her life and her children.
Yeah.
He got her a job in the federal government, and she was originally from Massachusetts or New Hampshire, I can't remember which, and she got in touch with him, and, you know, so, but yeah, I don't know that reference, and my
Well,
understanding was.
Anyway, yeah, there was a lot of activity in the whole New Orleans.
Oh.
I mean, really.
It was a mess.
And give the man credit for what he had to do,
Yeah,
and he stood up for, and you're right. Yeah, they can call him the beast, but he had to do what he had to do. And he settled things down.
yes, he
Because
did.
there was no other infractions after that.
Well, and when he passed that, when he issued that woman order,
Yeah,
that basically shut down women's bad behavior too. Because, you know, he said, I didn't have to throw anybody in jail. I mean, that wasn't exactly true. He did throw a couple of women in jail. But you know, it wasn't like things settled down. And then he was sent away from New Orleans.
yes.
And then they were clamoring for him to come back. You know,
Yeah.
please come back, because this other guy that's
Because
here, you know.
it's just, I mean, if you draw some of the parallels of then and today, you have, people want order in their life. You have, what goes around comes around. Defund the police, oh, and then you see all the chaos. Well, now, you know, we need order in our life, so please bring the police back, you know, so the same thing. But,
There must be, I want to make sure that other people get a chance to
yeah,
ask a
yeah.
question too, sorry.
yeah, sure, I'm sorry.
I just had a question. There was
Yes.
some allusion to Butler being related to the toothpick. That's-
Yes, and that's something that somebody else is gonna have to explain, because that was news to me, not today, but
Yeah, yeah.
where are you? Yes, can you explain the toothpick, or is there somebody here who can
No, I know where it is.
Bill, you don't know that?
I can,
Oh,
Bethany
so-
knows all
okay.
about
I
it,
can
too.
take an embarrassingly amateur stab at it.
Okay.
Which is basically that it was built as a sort of a pun on Ben Butler's big mouth. And the idea was that he was so noisy, and so boisterous, that he would need a toothpick that big. So it was a navigational tool.
And he was a great sailor, he loved to
He
sail.
was, so I
Yeah.
think it was a little bit of almost like an inside joke that
Yeah.
Ben Butler
Oh my
had
gosh.
such a big mouth that he would need a toothpick of this size. And Alex, do you have anything?
Yeah, Bethany, I'll cite as a source for this narrative the work of March and Skip Moss on the range lights here in Newburyport. Fred, correct me if I wander off the reservation here. In the late 1860s, 1870s so, it was proposed, as everybody knows, to run a railroad off the junction up by where the bridge is now, run it through where the rail trail is, and bring it out to the waterfront to deliver coal to the wharves in the front of Newburyport. From which they would be distributed. Okay. Butler was instrumental in getting the railroad funded to the waterfront, and he was also instrumental in creating the 2 range lights, funding them. And the purpose of the range lights was to offer a sighting as the ships came in from the mouth of the Merrimack. And if you kept the toothpick to your starboard, you would then, to your port, line up the 2 range lights and slide into the port, into the navigation channel, and wind up at the wharf so that you could deliver your coal. And that's the story of the toothpick as I know it, based on what Skip and Marge have narrated. Bethany?
I think that that's absolutely right, thank you, Alex, that was and then I think it became this sort of local, tongue-in-cheek, you know, joke.
Toothpick and cheek.
So,
It was his money.
it sounds like,
Or
yeah,
our money.
as a genuine
Our
homage,
ancestors'
it's hard
money.
work.
Well, it's still a tough entrance to come in the Merrimack. Whether Ben Butler is there or not, it's still pretty tough.
You had a question?
Yeah, I understand that Benjamin Butler and Caleb Cushing were very friendly. Did you come across anything that Butler said about Caleb Cushing?
I was just looking in my index today because I came to visit the house briefly earlier in the day, and I was like, whose house is this? Oh my gosh, it's Caleb Cushing. I know that Caleb Cushing was the person that Butler's mother appealed to the senator from New Hampshire, who then appealed to Caleb Cushing to get Butler an appointment to West Point, and that didn't work out. And then there was some more correspondence the next year because the Massachusetts slots were filled, but maybe they'll be open next year. And Caleb Cushing said no, and plus he's halfway through his career at Colby. So there was that. But later on, Cushing was, I gather, from reading my own index and then going back to my text, he was the convener of the Charleston Convention. So they would have, and they did periodically have communication, there's no question about it, because and later on, when Cushing was ambassador to Spain, there was some correspondence there too. I don't think they stayed really close, but Butler, maintained correspondence with a huge number of people. And I just off the top of my head remembered, oh yeah, he must have been ambassador to Spain because I seem to remember that. And the person upstairs said, yeah, here's a Spanish cigar, So, but they didn't remain super close, but there was some correspondence, yeah. So, but I did make me wonder if Butler had been in this house, which was
I would
cool.
say, I don't think he was in this house.
No?
Following the money,
No.
he could have been here.
If any, it would have been 63 High Street.
Where the Cushings lived?
Yeah.
Across the way.
Oh, okay.
Caleb Cushing lived here when he was married early on. When he came home from Harvard, he lived with his parents here and lived here when he was married. And then when he went to Congress, he really lived in Washington and visited here.
Yeah.
He bought 63 High Street
Oh,
in 1849.
so Butler may have been there.
Yeah, it could have been. There were some, Jefferson Davis was there.
Jefferson Davis.
And Pigeon, do you know, no, they were from the Mexican American
We're not supposed to
War.
mention Jefferson Davis.
No, just don't tell me, did you know that he did that? Why did he do that? Because he was a Democrat. Yes, Bill, you got a question.
Yeah, I was gonna ask about how remarkable was it that after the war, as a Democrat, a Northern Democrat, he had been a war Democrat, not Copperhead, but that he was pushing for the Reconstruction policies as hard as he was. That was pretty remarkable, right? And probably part of the story about why there's so much derision from Northerners against him as well.
Yeah, but it was even from Northern Republicans, and he ran as a Republican. I mean, he switched parties.
Oh, he did?
He did, yeah. He
Why
was.
did he do that?
During the war, he sort of moved toward the Republican Party, and then after the war, he ran as a Republican. But then he went back to the Democratic Party, and then he was sort of wandering in the desert on his own because, and I have seen more than once people say, well, he just had no values. He had no political compass at all. And actually, I think he would say, and I would agree from what I've seen, he did have a political compass, but parties don't remain stable. Parties go all over the place, and don't we know that for sure now? And he had certain things that mattered to him, and he was looking for his political home. And when he came out of the war, the people that he was trying to help, it was the Republican Party that seemed to be trying to enact but then the Republican Party sort of went off in a different direction, and then he was like, well, I don't feel at home in this party anymore either. And there were many of his correspondents were writing to him saying, dump the Republican Party. They're not the party that we thought they were. Now they're the party of, big banks and hard money, and, they hate the Chinese, and, so then he was like, what? And then they were saying, and you should make your own party, because there is no party that is the party of you. And that eventually he does sort of move in that direction, that he's thinking about creating a people's party, instead, that is a party for the underdogs. And, I always want to get this in because somebody out here has to write a book. One of you, please. I think I'm done. But I think, when this question of why Butler has been so forgotten or misrepresented when he is represented historically, I think has a lot to do with the fact that he was trying to push. I mean, he didn't help himself. He was irascible. He was not, he was charming to some people, but not to others. And he really didn't care what people thought about him. And he was abrasive and all those things. So he didn't help himself. But he also was very clearly pushing for a different agenda in Reconstruction than many Americans were pushing for pretty soon after the war. Pretty soon after the war, white Americans were trying to, North and South, put their arms around each other. Let's all go back to Gettysburg and, call it a brothers' war, throw the freed people under the bus, and so on. And he had a very different vision. And I think that it's uncomfortable it has been for many decades, uncomfortable for a lot of us to acknowledge that Reconstruction actually could have gone differently if we'd listened to if other people's voices had triumphed, perhaps like Benjamin Butler. But since that makes me uncomfortable, not me, but it makes, some of us uncomfortable, we'd rather make a joke out of, that person. And I bring this up because I think it's very interesting that there's another figure who has dropped completely off the historical map, who was very much in line with Butler's point of view, and was as good-looking and charming as Joshua Chamberlain. And this is Adelbert Ames, Butler's son-in-law, who fought tooth and nail in Mississippi to make sure that Reconstruction succeeded. And I want to know why we don't know more about him. Because if you don't like Butler because he's not, attractive, or he's too irascible, or he's this or he's that, okay, so you don't want to write about him. Why is there no biography of Adelbert Ames, who is a hero of his time, and lives right into the 20th century, has a beautiful wife, Butler's beautiful daughter, lots and lots of children who are all over Massachusetts and Maine, the children and the grandchildren. And so I think that's fascinating that we don't have that book. So please, somebody go write that book, because I can't do it.
I'm in.
Pardon?
If he's from Newburyport, I'm in.
He was from Rockland, Maine, actually. He was the first commander of the 20th Maine, before Joshua Chamberlain. But he's a fascinating figure. Loved his father-in-law, loved his wife too. And I love when Adelbert, this is kind of a funny story. Well, when Adelbert and Blanche, Butler's daughter, whom he nicknamed Bunty, when Bunty and Adelbert were going to get married, you know, the women in Benjamin Butler's life were very strong. His wife was strong, his mother was strong, he raised a strong daughter, and when his daughter and Adelbert Ames were going to get married, Blanche wrote to Adelbert and she said, I hope you don't expect me to say, I'm going to obey you. And he said, all I want is for you to love me. It's in the early 1870s. You don't have to obey me. Yeah. But the funny story I was going to tell you is that somebody did come up to me at the end of a talk. No, before I gave a talk in Maine, of all places where they should know better. He was from Maine. And he was dressed as a Union soldier. This man came up and he said, I'm Adelbert Ames. I thought, oh, geez. I said, you know, I have to tell you, if you're going to dress up as him and, you know, show up as him and introduce yourself as him, you got to pronounce his name right. It's Adelbert. Another question.
Yeah, you brought up the Bode-Colby rivalry thing, and it's very strong in our household. My wife and I both went to Colby and took Harold's course in Lovejoy 100.
You took Harold's course? Did you say Harold?
Yes, Harold.
Oh,
Yes.
lucky
And,
you.
Unfortunately, our son went to Bowdoin.
My son went to Bowdoin too. And he loved it.
My son loved it, our son loved it as well. But one time he actually did bring up the Chamberlain thing, and I had to remind him that at least Colby didn't offer a honorary degree to Jeff Davis.
Oh. Yeah, we gave one to Bill Cosby. We revoked that. Colby revoked the Bill Cosby one years after many of us were asking for that to be revoked.
I was just thinking that, you know, we read presently today about what people think about individuals and how Harry Truman was not very well respected. And he reminds me, some of the stuff, I did a little research today on my phone about Benjamin Butler, and I often think that Harry Truman was the guy in the 20th century that, written about in his own lifetime, not well respected. 45 or 50 years later, people were very much appreciative of what Harry Truman was able to accomplish. So I was thinking also that I taught history for 36 years, so my thought is that, you know, a lot of people don't realize Lincoln wasn't very well respected till the 20s. And when you read real 19th century writings about Lincoln, he's not given a lot of credit on anything. He's not held in a pedestal, he's not talked about, not well received. And then you get to the 20s, and the writers in the 20s who have had 50 years to look back write a different story than the history books that write in the 1870s. So I think maybe Benjamin Butler is just 100 years away from being successful. But
I won't be here to see it.
But the more you write about him, obviously the more interesting he becomes, and I think history's great because it does give you a perspective over a long period of time, and you can probably get closer to the truth on it.
I wish we taught it more and better. Yeah, it scares me that we're doing what we're doing to study history.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.